Wow. Friday the 13th, as if 2020 needed any help. But if you think that Friday the 13th, 2020 is too big a risk, then consider 57 years ago, when at the height of the Cold War, one of the very few facilities that was tasked with storing the American nuclear arsenal had an explosion of not just one, but several nuclear devices, driving many people to think, according to a 2020 edition of the magazine Texas Monthly, that the United States and the Soviet Union had gone to war. It is history that deserves to be remembered. The growth of the United States nuclear arsenal might be surprising to some. In 1947, the U.S. had enough electronic components for some 60 bombs, but only enough enriched fissile material to make 6. And even as much as we had the material, what we really had was bomb components. The U.S. atom bomb designs at the time were copies of the Mark III, the Fat Man bomb that had been dropped on Nagasaki on August 9, 1945. These bombs were large and complex. Physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer, the head of the Los Alamos laboratory, described them as still largely the haywire contraptions that were slapped together in 1945. The bomb design did not allow bombs to be stored assembled. The lead-acid batteries used to power the bomb's electronic components had to be periodically recharged. The neutron initiators used to kickstart the nuclear chain reaction had a limited half-life and had to be tested and often replaced. And the bomb cores had to be stored separately from the explosive blocks surrounding them because the cores generated heat, which could melt the plastic explosives that were necessary to cause implosion and trigger the nuclear reaction. Simply put, the bombs had to be stored in pieces and required experts to assemble them. But the U.S. thought it still needed the capability to fight a nuclear war. In the post-war period, we thought of our nuclear monopoly as the world guarantor of peace, and we began to more and more be concerned about the Soviet Union. While we still maintained a large military, we started to focus more on high-tech weapons like high-tech bombers and atomic bombs to counter the Soviet Union's superior numbers. As that strategy shifted from depending upon conventional forces to atomic forces, the U.S. military began a program to develop nuclear storage sites around the country where nuclear components could be stored next to military bases and could be quickly deployed in case of war. After the war, the Manhattan Project, the project that had developed the atom bomb, was succeeded by the Atomic Energy Commission, which had responsibility for nuclear development and testing, but also maintaining, storing, and securing the nation's nuclear weapons. This was done jointly with a new organization formed in 1947 called the Armed Forces Special Weapons Project, or AFSWP. This organization represented the Army, the Navy, and after its creation, the Air Force, and was involved both in training military personnel with the expertise needed to assemble the weapons and to store and stockpile the weapons so that they could be quickly brought into action in case the U.S. had to engage in atomic warfare. To facilitate the maintenance of a ready stockpile of nuclear weapons, a number of nuclear weapons storage and assembly sites were prepared with the efforts of the AEC and the AFSWP. These sites were cryptically called Q sites, referring to the Q level of security that was required by the AEC for all personnel and contractors who had access to the sites. The project to develop these storage sites was called Project Water Supply. The sites were intended to be geographically dispersed, both to make them less vulnerable to attack and to facilitate rapid deployment. The Q areas were associated with abutting military reservations, but were heavily guarded with their own security forces. The national storage sites were alpha-coded. Site K, or King, was Medina Base, located on 3,700 acres of land southwest of Lackland Air Force Base, Texas. Constructed between 1953 and 1955, the AEC and the Armed Forces Special Weapons Project started using Medina Base as a weapons storage area in 1955. The site was one of 13 storage sites for nuclear weapons. But in a testament to how quickly the development of weapons was occurring, in 1958 the basic mission of Medina Base changed when it was designated a Modification Center for atomic weapons. Changes in weapons technology made the initial stockpile plan unnecessary, as newer designs did not need the large infrastructure to prepare them for deployment. The mission of the modification centers was to perform nuclear weapons stockpile surveillance, modifications, retrofits, and weapon retirements. The Medina Modification Center became operational in 1959, and the AEC discontinued storage of nuclear weapons, so the facility would concentrate solely on weapons disassembly and modification. The operation of the facility was handled by Kentucky-based contractor Mason and Hanger. The Department of Defense had grouped the buildings into 3 main compounds, each surrounded by 3 concentric rings of chain-link fence, topped with barbed wire. Canine units and armed guards patrolled the grounds. Demilitarization involved the dismantling of nuclear weapons, including the disposition of both radioactive and non-radioactive components and the burning of the high explosive components. Several types of buildings were constructed, each built with structural elements meant to control accidents. Among those were about 100 concrete and steel structures used for storage called igloos. On November 13, 1963, the Medina Modification Center was in the process of retiring Mark 7 nuclear bombs. The Mark 7 was a variable-yield tactical fission bomb. More than 3,000 were made, and hundreds were being taken out of service at the time. The facility removed the weapon's cores, and then the explosive shells, spheres of TNT covered in detonators about the size of a beach ball, were transferred to storage in the igloos, awaiting destruction by incineration. Without their nuclear cores, the devices couldn't produce a nuclear yield, but the cores, which weighed hundreds of pounds, contained quite a lot of conventional explosives and some radiological material in the form of normal uranium and depleted uranium. The shells were carried to the igloo, numbered 527, by a straddle carrier, a tall and wide vehicle which carried its load underneath. The spheres were then to be unloaded by two contractors, 36-year-old Louis Eilinger Sr. and 23-year-old Floyd Lutz, using a forklift, while the third contractor, 29-year-old Hilary Huser, was outside the building keeping track of the weapons on a log. A report by the Division of Radiological Health of the U.S. Public Health Service explained that at 10:24 a.m., Huser was startled by a large crack inside the igloo, similar to that occurring when a shotgun is fired, and saw Lutz and Eilinger running towards him. Eilinger reported that he heard a swoosh and felt wind rushing past, and Lutz noted a flash, heard an explosion, was aware of feeling grittiness in his eyes, a burning of the face, and a sensation of pressure on the upper portion of his body. They didn't have to tell me to run, Huser told Texas Monthly magazine earlier this year. Huser ran one direction, and Eilinger and Lutz ran the other direction. Huser was trying to run to the next set of igloos in order to set off an alarm. He said, "I got about halfway, and the whole thing blew up." It's not clear what caused the initial spark. The Center for Defense Information simply stated, while 3 employees were dismantling the high explosive component of the nuclear bomb, it began burning spontaneously. A 1964 site assessment said, a spark ignited the assemblies and they began to burn uncontrollably. An Air Force report, while saying that the exact cause is unknown, speculated that the accident was the result of an accidental mechanical contact between 2 high explosive components. Floyd Lutz, quoted in the Texas Monthly, simply said, "There is no direct answer as to what caused it that we know of." But the effect came quickly. The 1964 site report says, about 45 seconds later, the burning assemblies detonated, setting off additional high explosive assemblies. The Air Force report says that the igloo doors were blown from the facility in the initial stages of the blast. The final result of the blast was a complete vaporization of the igloo contents, a sizable crater, and the removal of some rock strata below the igloo. A 1998 report from the National Resource Defense Council explained that the explosives detonated with a force of over 60 tons of TNT. The first explosion set off other sub-assemblies in the igloo and those still on the carrier. The igloo disappeared in a cloud of smoke and dust, leaving a crater some 20 feet deep. The explosion was felt throughout San Antonio. The 1964 report noted that the shock wave broke windows in downtown San Antonio some 12 miles away and was audible 50 miles away. A contemporary newspaper report said that the smoke cloud that was thrown up from the explosion was visible 6 miles away. Texas Monthly magazine quoted a former student at Lackland Elementary School who said, "We thought World War III had started," and noted that the plate glass window that fronted the Continental bus station in San Antonio 13 miles away was blown in. Perhaps most surprising, Eilinger, Lutz, and Huser all managed to escape the blast and the raining debris. A spokesman for the AEC told newspapers at the time, 3 men were loading the explosive into an igloo. They saw a flash and realized that something was going to explode, and so they ran. The 1964 site report simply said the 3 technicians were not seriously injured. The Air Force report said, fortunately, site personnel received no serious injuries. The Public Health Service report said that Huser took refuge behind a clump of bushes, where for several seconds he was aware of debris falling all about. A fragment of some kind struck the hard toe of one of his safety boots. Eilinger managed to hide in a small culvert and was struck on the back and legs by several apparently relatively soft fragments, probably mostly clay. While he was hit on the back of the right arm above the elbow with a missile, Lutz quoted in Texas Monthly that, "We were lucky enough not to be blowed to pieces." their injuries were surprisingly light. Huser had a rupture of his left eardrum, which appeared to be healing the next day. Lutz had a small vertical laceration above his left eyebrow, and Eilinger had bruises on his arm and the back of his legs. Sampling for radiological contamination began immediately and was conducted in the air as well as with soil and vegetation samples by the Air Force, the AEC, and the Division of Occupational Health and Radiation Control of the Texas State Department of Health. Conclusions at the time concluded. In summary, it appears that there was no significant contamination of the area in which these samples were taken as a result of the Medina base incident. This was largely because the radiological material involved was not particularly dangerous, although recent analysis by the Air Force has recommended some site remediation in the vicinity of the explosion. The Disaster Research Center at the Ohio State University did an analysis of the organizational response to the accident at the time, and they found that despite all the heightened tensions and awareness of the Cold War, there was little organizational coordination and no apparent plan in the eventuality that there was, say, an accident at the airbase that might lead to fallout over San Antonio. They also noted that there was a distressing communication gap that came because of slow communication response by the AEC. But perhaps most disturbing is that they found out that despite the fact that it was common knowledge that there were nuclear weapons at the airbase, after the explosion there was a convergence of people on the site of the explosion, which is where the risk of fallout would have been greatest and which could have been disastrous had there been more nuclear material involved. Or that is to say that the greatest lesson perhaps to learn from the accident is don't go looky-loo at the site of nuclear accidents. Now you might think that since this was actual explosions of components of nuclear bombs, despite the fact that they'd had their nuclear cores removed, that the United States would remember this accident, but it appears to be fairly poorly remembered in the United States, except perhaps in the San Antonio era. And that might be because of the news cycle. This happened on November 13th, 1963, and just over a week later, the President of the United States visited San Antonio, flew from there to Houston, and then on to Fort Worth, where he spent the night. And the next day, on November 22nd, shots rang out as the President's motorcade passed the Texas School Book Depository in Dallas. And the explosion in San Antonio a week earlier was pushed out of the news and the public consciousness and became nearly forgotten history. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.